Alrighty, everyone. Well, welcome, and just make sure everyone is on mute if you can be. And Todd, you'll let in anybody who's here late. Actually, at this moment, let me make sure I make Todd
Oh, yeah.
the co-host. I didn't do that. Alrighty. So, welcome to Agnes Varda. I call this the Queen of French cinema. If anything, she's kind of the grandmother of French New Wave, grandmother, mother. We'll get to that in a moment. All right. But yeah, Agnes Varda, as I described it, might be one of the best filmmakers you have not heard of yet. All right, why is this not letting me bring this up? Come on. There we go. Um, but yeah, she is. I think a lot of people would consider her like the queen of French cinema, maybe the grandmother, but she is vitally important to both French cinema, specifically French New Wave cinema, but she is also very important in terms of global cinema. As we'll see as we go on in the program, she certainly had a lot of famous fans, and a lot of very world-renowned filmmakers do cite her as an influence. So just a quick who she is. I mean, if you've read The Constant Contact or the program description, you might gather she's a writer, she's a director, she's also documentarian. She does both fictional and non-fictional narratives. She's a visual artist. She actually got her start as a photographer. And again, she is both called the mother and the grandmother of the French New Wave, which she always found very funny because she was in her like mid 20s to 30 when her first two films came out. But as she aged and aged along with the film industry, she became a very revered figure, and that's where the grandmother of French New Wave came in. And I would also like to give this book, A Complicated Passion, a shout out. This was the main text I worked on with this project. Written by Carrie Rickey. We have the audiobook in the GMOOCs consortium. You could also see if someone else in New Hampshire has it, or you could go to your favorite bookstore and buy it. I will say, go to a local bookstore instead of a let's just say an online corporate giant that sells books and a lot more things. Local bookstores, like libraries, are in many ways a lifeblood for community. So I would say support those as well. Also, for anyone wondering, Agnes has had that haircut for roughly her entire career, which I love. And she is just someone who, as I'll discuss going on in the program, was full of life and creativity and curiosity up until the end of her life. She passed away in 2019. She was in her almost 90 years old at that point. She had had a career that spanned over 60 years. So I think it goes without saying, I'm going to cover a lot in this program, but I do not think there is any way I can cover everything. So I would recommend watching some of her films, reading more about her, reading A Complicated Passion. But I will try to do as much justice as I can with the time allotted. So we're going to start with Arlette, which is uh, her birth name, and this was the early life for Agnes. So she was born on May 30th in 1928 in Brussels. And she was the third of five children, and for her, she never quite felt like she completely fit in with her family. So she had a older brother and sister and a younger brother and sister, and they were kind of paired off, and she kind of saw herself as the odd child out. But that is not to say that she came from a family that was neglectful of her or pushed her out. That was more she just kind of felt a little disconnected. Her mother was very artistic, and her father, who was Greek, was an intellectual and a free thinker, definitely um someone who was not very religious. That actually led to Agnes going to get confirmed in a church simply to kind of push back against her father, despite her not being religious herself and really not being a person who believed in any of that stuff. Um, she actually had a very, not quite a strained relationship with her father, but as free thinking as he was a little iffy about her going into like arts and filmmaking. And I believe he passed away before her first feature had even come out. She definitely had a better relationship with her mother. Um, this is a fun anecdote that I liked and I had to share. So she wasn't really someone who was that interested in film growing up. She didn't see a lot of film. So her first movie was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and she actually hated it. And I have this excerpt from the book. Varda was 9 or 10 when she saw her first film. Christiane took her to the Cinema Metropole, Brussels Art Deco movie place, to see Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1938. It was one of the few films she saw before making one. Though she loved fairy tales and myths, and though Christiane was enchanted and bought small felt replicas of the dwarfs for her children, Varda had little use for the Disney version. Quote, what is certain is that I hated Snow White, Varda remembered 60 years later. I found her ugly and silly. I was like, why does she take care of these little ones all the times? Why is she doing this? And then when I saw Prince Charming, I found him hideous, ridiculous, soft, and insipid. And then I was very afraid of the witch, excruciating and cruel. Later, Varda would tell critic Amy Tobin that what she remembered disliking about the movie was its valorization of the heroine for cleaning the house of the dwarfs without pay. A sophisticated critique for a 10-year-old. But unfortunately, the fun of going to movies did not last long for Agnes and her family, because if you notice the year 1938, and where they lived, World War II was pretty much already in progress. And in 1940, they went to France to say it. But during that time, they lived on a boat called Poppet. And that was not an incredibly fun way to live. But Agnes, she wrote it, she goes, I don't remember being afraid. I had my parents, I had my siblings. And for them, it was just, okay, we're going on an adventure, we're traveling. Her parents, to their credit, did do a lot to try to keep the more horrific realities of the war away from the children. And so when they settled in Set, she met the Schlegel family, and the family, and specifically the daughters, are who Agnes really bonded with, and in many ways kind of set her course for the rest of her life and for her film career. And as I note at the bottom, she was not always called Agnes. She was called Arlette, and she changed her name. And some places say that she legally changed it. Ricky's book says that she didn't. I'm going to side with Ricky on this one, as she did a lot of work. But she chose Agnes for two reasons. One, it was common among her ancestors. Two, it sounded more grown up. She didn't like the name Arlette. She said it sounded too childish, too kiddish, and she just simply did not want to have that name following her around for the rest of her life. So the Schlegel sisters were, in a way, kind of became her, I don't want to say a real family, but her surrogate family, and the family that she found a lot more connection with. Um, all three of the sisters were very artistically inclined, and the father was artistically inclined as well. He did woodworking and he made furniture, but that's still something artistic. And Agnes remembered loving the smell of his studio and how it always smelled like wood. And considering Agnes would go into doing like visual art, three-dimensional installations, this idea of Agnes liking stuff that is the art that is tactile, we kind of see this early on. But the sisters, she loved spending time with. She kind of becomes the fourth sister of this family. So André does woodblock and linoleum prints. Suzanne is really interested in music, and Valentine was a sculptor. And actually, something I learned from this, I am really not that familiar with the world of sculpture, but Valentine Schlegel was a famous sculptor herself. So she kind of had her own path in the art world as well. So they get her into art and kind of have her see it as something beyond something frivolous. So as much as her mother Christiane encouraged art when she was younger, again, Agnes kind of felt a little like, I don't know, is she almost living vicariously through me? Does she actually want me to do art, or is she encouraging me to do it because she couldn't do it herself? Versus when she hangs out with the sisters, she sees women who have a real passion for it, and then it encourages her to explore the side as well. So once the occupation ends, she goes to school, she takes art history courses. She also takes stuff like painting, printmaking, archaeology. But what she really connects with is photography. And that's kind of, in many ways, the stepping stone for her becoming a filmmaker. She loves taking photos, she loves taking pictures of stuff. And photography is something that stays with her throughout her entire career. Um, and also, as we see on the bottom, the sisters are the ones that kind of get her into film. Again, Agnes, she even said when she made her first movie, she's like, I think I've only seen like 20 to 25 films total in her entire life. I mean, you know, contrast this with someone like Martin Scorsese or Roger Ebert, who like would go see a picture every weekend, or me, who goes to see at least one movie a weekend. By the way, saw Mickey 17 this weekend. Great movie. You should watch it. But one of the films she does remember seeing is Suzanne takes her to go see Children of Paradise, which she does love. She likes it a lot more than Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I will forever love her analysis of Snow White and Seven Dwarfs. I also have never been the biggest fan of that movie, and I'm starting to wonder if low key that's the reason why. I'm like, why is she cleaning up their home for them? Shouldn't they just be cleaning themselves? But yeah, so the biggest thing, the biggest takeaway from Agnes is just dipping her toe into many different types of art and art history and art adjacent stuff is finding a love of photography. And that is what informs her first film, which is La Pointe Courte. And that's in 1955. This is her debut feature. So she ended up taking numerous pictures around set, and she used that to actually storyboard the film itself. So this film, which is about a woman deciding whether or not she wants to continue her marriage, it started off as a little bit of a short movie, 6-minute film, and then she expanded it into a feature film. Um, the way she went about it, it wasn't this burning desire to be a filmmaker. She, when she was making it, she kind of figured, I think this is just going to be something I try to do. So one part of it was interest, like I want to see if I can do it. I have this idea in my head and I want to get it out. But there's also a very personal component to this. So Suzanne, she had married an actor at the not an actor, sorry. Her husband at the time was sick. He was terminally ill and they were both in set, and Varda wanted to make this movie for him because so the setting and the scenery and all of the locations were around a place that he loved. And we'll see this in Varda's later work as well. The people she uses, they're in many cases just regular people off the street. I wouldn't say rarely, but she didn't like to use very professional actors, at least not for every role. For a lot of the side roles, smaller roles, she would just pick people. So this is a very personal project for her and for her dear friend Suzanne. So it's made for a low budget at the time, $14,000, and Alan Rene, if that name sounds familiar, he directed, Todd, do you know which film he directed?
I am blanking off the top of my head, admittedly.
Hiroshima Mon Amour. Helps her edit the film, and he's the one who says, like, oh, you storyboarded this with photography, like, this is great. And then Valentine Schlegel, the sculptor, she is in charge of art direction. So this is like a labor of love, as with a lot of these tours are. Like their first films are like, I will pull in whoever I can to help me out. Um, but he's the one who says like, this is a great. Renee is the one who says this is a great film, and really helps encourage her to show it around, and he helps shop it around himself. So the receptionist is really positive, and it gains the attention of a lot of the who's who of the sort of French New Wave. So Truffaut, the 400 Blows, he said the film was too composed, although he did say earnest and intelligent. And then a few years later, he actually kind of walked that back a bit. Was like, well, now that I've seen Varda's other work and I kind of see what she's doing, he reevaluated that film as well. And this kind of started her, not kind of, it absolutely did, started her career making films. But for her, she, in order to get any kind of funding, she formed her own company, Tamaris. So, Todd, I showed you Vagabond last night. Cine Tamaris was one of the companies, and registered with the Centre National du Cinéma. So that's French's in France. And so for the rest of the 50s, she ended up making short films. She didn't make another full-length feature for another 7 years. So Diary of a Pregnant Woman, Along the Coast, Aux Saisons au Château, and La Côte d'Azur. All in 1958. And some of these were almost done as like tourist movies for the like the French Bureau of Tourism. Other ones, it's just short films for art. It's amazing that, when you have a country that just funds arts for art's sake, it's pretty great. But while La Pointe Court was a good debut for her, she really didn't break into the international stage until Cleo from 5 to 7. And I think if anyone has heard of any Varda film, this is the Varda film you've heard of. If you took film courses in college, this is oft reference. I first saw this film in my freshman year of college, an intro to cinema, and Cleo from 5 to 7 was one of the ones they used to demonstrate editing, specifically jump cuts. I still remember first seeing it's the shot of her walking down the stairs. Rather than it being a wider shot of just seeing her walk down steps, there's short jump cuts almost to punctuate every step this woman is stepping down on. So you've probably heard of this movie more than you may have seen it, because it is one of those movies that is kind of listed as a movie you need to see, and it's talked about a lot in terms of how influential it is. But I can't speak for around the world, but there are a lot of American cinephiles where a lot of their knowledge begins and ends with American cinema. I certainly have more of a knowledge of American cinema than other countries. But I have seen Cleo from 5 to 7. The plot of the film is about a pop star, Cleo. It's a 90-minute period where she's waiting the results of a biopsy to see if she has breast cancer. And there's a lot of her friends from French cinema. Varda was friends with, like, I was reading the book, and her and Jacques Demy's friend group was like the who's who of French cinema at the time. They were friendly with Truffaut. One of them was like, "Oh, she's hanging out with Godard and Anna Karina." And I'm like, my God, just so casually. And if you're not familiar with Godard, Godard directed Breathless. Anna Karina was in a lot of French films at the time. They made cameos in this film for her. And what's interesting about the film is Cleo, in this 90-minute span, goes through a lot of feelings and emotions. So you see her at first, she's almost comes across as a little bratty, a little spoiled, as we would imagine a pop star to be. But as it goes along, when she leaves her handlers, we see a different side of her, the side of her that's afraid, the side of her that's vulnerable, the side of her that is contemplating her own mortality at this point. And Antoine Bouslier, who actually was the father of Varda's first child, Rosalie, makes cameo appearance in this film. He is a soldier that Cleo bonds with over their own mortality. Again, him being a soldier, he's also contemplating, like, what could happen if I could die? So the film is a hit in France, and it really it skyrockets her to international fame, and it earns her a fan with a 19-year-old Martin Scorsese, who saw the film when he was 19 years old in school, and for him this blows him away. He said, quote, for Martin Scorsese, then 19 and an undergraduate at New York University, Cleo was, quote, quite a shock, comma, one that, quote, opened my eyes to thinking in many ways. Quote, I felt that I was seeing the world and experiencing time from a woman's point of view for the first time in movies, he recalled. He didn't understand those who criticized it for being insufficiently somber. There was a remarkable sense of freedom and poignancy at those moments where she looks in the mirror. Is it just a pop star obsessed with her looks, he wondered? He experienced it as a woman confronting her mortality. No male director would have dared that kind of lyricism under those dramatic circumstances. And keep in mind, in 1962, there were women filmmakers. Women filmmakers have been a part of cinema pretty much since cinema's inception, but it has always been harder for women to break into the internet, if anything, break into the boys' club, as it were. And in some cases, movies about women were automatically seen as somehow more frivolous or not as serious, especially when women direct them. If I want to give an example, I was talking about a year ago when there was discussion of Barbie, a film directed by Greta Gerwig, and though it deals with Mattel's doll, it is a film that also goes through a lot of stuff in terms of gender roles and expectation. It's very humanist. There is this underlying current of what does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to live, which is finding your own path. That's the joy of life. A lot of people immediately dismiss Barbie as, well, this can't be a movie that deals with anything serious. It's just pink and it's poppy and there's pop music in it. What could it actually discuss? And the answer is quite a lot. And, looking back, it's like, wow, like 60 years ago, Cleo from 5 to 7 got similar criticism of, oh, how can a movie that's about a pop star and has, these fun moments in it really be dealing with anything serious? And, the answer is very easily. In many cases, movies like this have walk this tightrope of dealing with heavier issues while having levity. And Cleo from 5 to 7 is a perfect example of a film that does do that. So for the rest of the 60s, Varda goes back and forth between doing shorts and doing features. And for her personal life, there's a lot of change. So her first child, Rosalie, born to Bouslier, is in 1954. He is not legally listed as Rosalie's father. Um, Rosalie was spoken to about it, and it's just kind of for whatever the reasons were, it just seemed like he really didn't want to be a parent that much, although apparently he was present in Rosalie's life for a little bit, but afterwards there was just estrangement between him and Varda. But the person Rosalie really considers her father is Jacques Demy. We'll get into her Varda and Demy a little bit later, but just a quick little rundown. If you're not familiar with Jacques Demy, you've probably heard of The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, Young Girls of Rochefort. I really hope I'm not butchering these French names. I probably am. Uh, they are married in 1962, the same year Cleo premieres and becomes an international sensation. That's probably the big event in Varda's life, or the two biggest events. One, her getting respect on the national stage or international stage, and then marrying Jacques, who is by all accounts the love of her life. She makes a couple of follow-up features. One is La Bonheur, the happiness, which is I'll discuss later, but a quite a shock in terms of how the mood of Cleo versus the mood of La Bonheur. And then she also makes The Creatures, which is a science fiction film. And there was an interview I read with Varda, like towards the end of her life, and she still goes like, "Ooh, my first bomb." People did not like that film, although that's another one that people kind of reevaluated and are like, "This one's actually quite good." Um, Later in the 60s, both Demi and Varda go to California. Demi is being courted by a US studio to make a film. So she goes over there and she's just like, well, I might as well make some movies as well. She makes a short about the Black Panthers. She also makes Lions, Love, and Lies, which is about like kind of a hippies in California. Definitely not as well received. She also was treated fairly condescendingly in California. There was a Columbia exec who actually pinched her cheek at one point. And she's like, she kind of brushes it off, but she definitely, felt that, women directors were still not taken as seriously while she was over there. So to talk about Le Bonheur. So The Happiness, which is an interesting title considering the film, especially the final part of this film, is incredibly dark movie. And it starts out as a very kind of typical story. It's a man, he has his wife, he has his children, he's very happy. And then he finds a single woman who looks a lot like his wife, and they strike up a relationship and a conversation. In the end, the way this movie ends is incredibly shocking. And you could read it as romantic in the very classical tragic sense. You could read it as very cynical. You could read it as angry. There are many people who have read it as a feminist critique about how men can move on, women cannot, in terms of how easy it is to leave a marriage and a relationship, or a woman's place in a relationship, i.e., are they something to be replaced? Versus the man can always start anew. I do not want to spoil the film. That's why I'm being a little bit vague. But the genesis for this was funding fell through for a project Varda wanted to do, and she was very upset. So this came out of that anger and frustration and sadness. But still, the controversy of this film, it generated interest for the movie and it got it acclaim. And there were a lot of women at the time who watched this who were like, yes, this is shocking, but it's also something that we're connecting with. And Ricky, who's also a film critic, points this out in her book, and she says, ultimately, Le Bonheur is a mordant social satire and cinematic Rorschach blot that teases out the viewer's feelings about marriage, fidelity, and male prerogative. And I think I will leave you with that. I would definitely recommend trying to find this film and watch it. It is available on disc via the Criterion Collection. You can probably watch it on something like Max or the Criterion Channel as well, if you're more inclined to do streaming. But it is if you're familiar with her, I mean, Vagabond also has some darkness to it, but this is definitely one of her darker films. So I wanted to get back to Jacques Demy and Agnes Varda, who the title of the book, A Complicated Passion, actually comes from how Varda would describe her relationship with Jacques. They were, by all accounts, an incredibly happy couple who did love each other and were a cinematic power couple in many ways. They met in 1955 at the Tours Festival of Film Shorts. He was there with La Belle Indifférente. She was there with Aux Saisons au Château. They met, struck up a conversation, moved in 1959, married in 1962. Demy legally adopted Rosalie. And again, Rosalie's always said she considered him to be her, more present father figure. And then they had Matthew in 1972. And if you watch his movies and her films, you can probably gather, like, it's not surprising. He was definitely the more playful. He liked to have a lot of fun. He liked a lot of bright colors. She was more serious, but he was also one when he plotted out his films, they were very structured versus when she made her films. She was a little more, not quite loosey-goosey, but she was a lot more willing to improvise and kind of go with the flow of the moment. And they were together for about 2 decades. They were married up until his death in 1990, but they separated at the end of the 1970s. Jacques Demy was bisexual. There was also some evidence that Varda was as well. There, in Carrie Ricky's book, she does talk about how there was always some question as to what her relationships with Valentin Schlegel was. There was talk that there may have been some kind of romantic affair at some point. But the anger that, or I guess I should say frustration and disappointment that Varda had when he left was not due to his sexuality. It was the fact that he had left. But they still worked out a way where they could co-parent their son, and they were still in communication. They would still be social together. This was actually something that when they had their separation, only the closest friends knew what had actually happened. Their cover was, well, he wants to live in California and make films there. I want to live here instead. And they handled it overall very maturely. And then when he passes away in 1990, she doesn't remarry. So Varda's progress, as I kind of hinted at before, was a lot more improvisational. In some case, like she would storyboard like she would for La Pointe Courte, but sometimes she would like to see where the film would take her, or she would change things. She would have a basic idea of what she was doing, but sometimes she'd be like, "Oh, you know what? I think I want to do this instead of that." She'd rework a script, as a lot of people do. Actually, if I could say a contemporary who I could probably compare her to would be Mike Leigh of Secrets and Lies, very recently Hard Truths. He also does like, well, whenever I shoot, I don't quite have the script completely finished. And she sorry, lost my train of thought. But she liked to kind of see how the film would surprise her in a way. So she always said she liked to use the camera as a pen, almost as if she was writing a novel rather than making a film. And so you watch some of her movies, like One Sings, the Other Doesn't, and like Vagabond, where they're not movies with like beginning, middle, end structure. It's more you almost look at them kind of like you're reading chapters in a novel, especially one sings the other doesn't, is one where I feel is a very novel approach versus you know, a more strict structure of a film. And photography plays into her work a lot as well. She'll use a lot of still photographs in her work, or even when you like just look at a lot of her shots, you see that she looks at the composition the way a photographer would look at a composition. Although granted, photography and cinematography, not, I think a lot of people would argue it's not as far off as one would think. And I would say most importantly, she would employ women on her sets a lot. And this is actually at the time not entirely something every woman director would do. So in like the 60s and 70s, there was starting to be a resurgence of women directing in Europe and in the United States. But um, it didn't always mean that the women who were directing would open the doors to other women. So this is from Ricky's book as well. While Varda made largely female focused stories with unconventional editing, she was also helping change the face of the French film industry by hiring women for key production and creative roles. She employed or encouraged two generations of female assistant directors, cinematographers, and editors who continue to work in cinema in various capacities. Some, like Lynn Littman and Patricia Mazoy, would themselves become award-winning directors. Renowned filmmaker Chantal Akerman, if that name sounds familiar, she directed the fantastic film Jean Dillman, which was voted best film of all time in the Sight and Sound poll. Chantal Akerman never worked for Varda, but like Holland, Agnes Agnieszka Holland, I hope I'm saying that name right, Polish director. Like Holland, she was inspired by Varda's professional and personal example. In a 2011 interview, Ackerman contrasted Marguerite Duras and Varda, filmmakers from the older generation. This is quoted from Ackerman. Marguerite built up airs around herself that she would promote with Agnes, and we were sometimes competitive. But Agnes is capable of moments of great generosity towards women, where Marguerite was only capable of generosity to men. And in many, for Holland, Agnes was quote a mother figure to many women filmmakers. So as we see in that Ackerman quote, there were directors who would try to ingratiate themselves to men, but wouldn't exactly want to work with other women, versus Varda would try to hold the door open for other people as well. And that that's one of the cases Ricky makes, and a lot of other women filmmakers who revere Varda as well revere her not only for her creative work and her impact, but the fact that rather than shutting the door behind herself or pulling the ladder up, whatever metaphor you would like to use, she held the door open for other women to also break into the film industry. So as we get into the 1970s, we see that she doesn't have the filmography that she had in the 50s. Big reason for that was her son Matthew. She and Jacques Demy's son was born in 1972, and that definitely led to her taking a little bit of a break from filmmaking, which kind of frustrated her a bit, but informed some of her work later on. So she makes Daguerreotypes, which is about Rue de Guerre, where she lives, which is like narrative, but also a nonfiction, very documentary-esque. And then she makes Women Reply, where she asks a lot of women, like, what does it mean to be a woman? And a lot of that was, you know, stuff about giving birth, but a lot of it was also, this is in the 1970s, where feminist movements are cropping up around the world. Women talking about what it was like to exist in that space. And this all culminates in her big narrative feature from the 70s, which is One Sings, the Other Doesn't, which we'll get to in a moment. In terms of working in the film industry, she working in the film industry and doing the way like feminism impacted it. She in France signs the manifesto of the 343 in 1971. So if you're not familiar with what that is, like as in many countries, abortion was completely illegal in France until the 1970s. There's actually a very good film called Happening, takes place in the 60s, which you should see. But these were women who said they were either in support of it or in many cases had had abortions themselves illegally in order to basically live their lives. So she signed that, which again, a gutsy move back then, not only for a public figure, but for any woman to put themselves out there and face whatever scorn or judgment there was. She also still kind of felt that she wasn't being taken entirely seriously by a lot of men in the industry. And she was actually very happy to have Martin Scorsese, who was in the 1970s in America, one of the big not even up and coming, but one of the faces of new Hollywood cinema, be a filmmaker that was in her corner. So this is from Ricky's book, quote, his respect for her film work meant a lot during this period as she was feeling regularly condescended to by, quote, feminist men, mostly journalists and directors, who held a not bad for a woman attitude towards her work. During the publicity blitz for One Sings, Varda pushed back against this paternalism. She said, quote, we, blacks and women, have only recently been decolonized and we must find our own way. We should not be ready to go back along with the anxieties of so many male artists who project their issues onto women. And she put, these are men that she names, like Modigliani, Giacometti, and especially Ingmar Bergman. So she at least had like some guys in her corner, but she was still feeling like a lot of the big names in films kind of had the, that condescending head patting, the, oh, you're sweet, you're making movies, good for you. So she was dealing with that. She, at the beginning of the decade, she has Jim Morrison, who she was friends with, pass away. She is actually one of the people who she puts it, she goes, I didn't want to alert people right away because I was scared for the publicity that was just going to come down on him. Because his private life was also something very splashed across the pages. But the biggest personal tragedy for her came at the end of the decade. So first she goes back to California. She has two movies she wanted to make. They both fell through. But the bigger shock to her is when Demi says, I love you, but I also love this man, and I would like to live with him. And it was also just at that point, at the end of the 70s, homosexuality had become a lot more acceptable. It wasn't as stigmatized to live with a man. And he wanted to live his life that way. So, as sad and angry as she was, they still worked something out. And the separation was kept very secret. Only, as I said earlier, only their really closest friends knew what was what was really going on. Versus professionally, it was, we are living separately for professional reasons. I would like to live and work in France. He wants to live and work in California. But I said I would get to One Sings, the Other Doesn't. This is a wonderful film. We do have it at the Derry Public Library. And again, you watch this movie, it does seem almost like you're reading a novel and you're just seeing different chapters of these two women's lives. So this is 14 years of friendship between two women. One at the is already an adult who is married with two kids. The other is still a teenager. And it tackles so many different things that affect women: abortion, divorce, childcare, and ultimately the desire to just live the life you want. And really, if you watch this film and people would, I would like to show this to a lot of people, like, oh, what do women really want? What is the feminist woman movement trying to accomplish? I'm like, it just means we want to live our lives the way we want to live our lives, and we don't want to be constrained by these things. And Varda herself said she didn't set out to make the film to be a political film. But it's just because she was tackling things that were in her mind at the time and what she was seeing, it became a political film, but that also led to the movie's success. Although she kind of got pushback on it. There were some people who felt, oh, it wasn't feminist enough, or it was, quote, too easy on the men, which I don't know. I watched that movie and I'm like, I don't know how you can say that, but all right. And there was a critique that it, quote, simplified women's lives. And I loved this quote where she goes, you have a film where women are without guilt, without shame, without dependency, without stupidity, and they're fighting against these laws and institutions, getting value and putting value into women's ventures. Don't you think you're already getting quite a lot? And by that, she means from this film. And it is. It's a film that, while it is political, it is not out to put other people down. It is out there to simply lift up the women in this film. And Todd, this was, I think, until I showed you Vagabond last night, the only Varda film you had seen. Would you care to share your thoughts on it? Resident Man, share your thoughts on this film.
Besides the fact that I kind of came out of it going, why is it taking me this long to watch a Varda film?
Hmm.
Because I mean, that really was the first thing. I was just, again, this worked. This did work well for
Yeah.
me. I didn't really feel like I was slighted in any way, but I thought this was a compelling story about two women just basically pursuing what they wanted in life.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great movie. I'm glad that the DPL has a copy because I think more people should see it. It's not her most famous movie, but it's I think one of her more accessible films for a lot of people to watch. And it's a great film, and I hope you guys seek it out. So going into the 1980s, at the start, Varda is still in California. She's still in LA. She's working through some of her wounds. Actually, at this time in the early 80s, this is where she works with Lynn Littman, who would go on to direct the excellent 1983 film Testament. Um, so she makes Murmurs, which is about murals in Los Angeles, and then she makes Documenteur, which is a fictional film about a woman looking for a place to stay with her and her son finding a place to live. Which again, you kind of watch that movie and you read the synopsis, you're like, ooh, I can see the real life events that are kind of influencing this. Um, but she goes back to France, and she makes Vagabond, which is her biggest hit since Cleo from 5 to 7. And it also becomes a big awards get for her. She also rekindles her friendship with Jane Birkin. Again, once again, Agnes Varda being friends with the who's who of the French cinema world. If you're not familiar with Jane Birkin is, she was married to Serge Gainsbourg. She is the mother of Charlotte Gainsbourg. And if you ever heard of the infamous Birkin bags, Jane Birkin was the namesake for those. If anyone was a fan of I believe both Sex and the City and Will and Grace had Birkin bag subplots in the early aughts. But Jane Birkin, despite I only knew her when I was younger as like, oh yeah, this is the bag. She was also an a very famous public figure and an actress as well. So she collaborates with her on two projects. One is a documentary, Jane B by Agnes V, and the other is the film Kung Fu Master, which let's just say Kung Fu Master would probably, I wouldn't say couldn't be made today, because after all, it is France, and France is France. I'll just leave it there. But if it were made today, it might have a very different tone. It is about a woman played by Jane Birkin who starts to fall for a young boy who is played by Varda's son, Matthew. It's definitely played up as more of an infatuation for a woman going through kind of a midlife crisis, but even Ricky admits in the book, like, oh yeah, this movie would not be received the same way. But that's also because, for a while there was a cultural thing about, I mean, number one, how many movies have there been and books have there been about, middle-aged men have being attracted to and infatuated with teen girls? So there is the gender flip subversion of that, but there is also this idea of for a while there was this idea of young men fantasize about older women and leading to a lot of tasteless jokes about, let's just say, real life figures. The movie May December discusses that a little bit better, but yeah, there's a lot in society has changed that we would look at this now and go, wait, no. So yeah, I don't know if I'd recommend Kung Fu Master. It's just one where it's like that's probably her most dated work, just on account of we all look at them, we're like, ew, no. But sadly, the end of the decade brings, again, as with the end of the 70s, probably one of the worst things to happen in Varda's life, which is finding out that Jacques is sick, and not just sick with any virus. He and both him and his partner David have contracted AIDS and will eventually be victims of the AIDS crisis that has not only been ravaging the United States, but had been the entire world at that point. So before that, we are going to discuss Vagabond, which I showed Todd last night. Great film, also available in our Gmail system. So this film comes from a real life inspiration of the Nouveau Pauvres, the New Poor. So these are usually young people. They don't have housing. They usually don't have steady work, and they're kind of traveling, hitchhiking from place to place, taking any odd jobs they can. Varda had initially envisioned this film being about two young men traveling in a car. And then she then thought about, no, single man hitchhiking. And then she initially settled on, no, I'm going to make this a woman hitchhiking. And the film does not shy away from all of the dangers that are presented to her. So the movie opens with, we find the character Mona. She is frozen to death in a ditch. So this is not a spoiler. We open with finding this woman at the end of her life. The film, instead, we go back and we both follow her journey through this French countryside, but we also meet numerous people who interact with her. One woman is a professor who first she's kind of like, oh, she smelled, but then later she just thinks like, I wonder if I can find her again. Like, I feel horrible that there's this young girl who seems to be in like her early 20s hitchhiking alone. It's unsafe out there. She meets another group of people she squats with. That guy talks about like, oh, I could have probably like made money off of her, i.e. pimping her out. There's another guy who's like, I let her wash a car for 30 francs. I would have let her pump gas. I didn't trust her. And what's interesting as I watch this and as we're seeing a rise in homelessness across the country as well, it's kind of there is this there's sadly a timelessness to this where it's like how many other people do we see who are walking with like a tent and a backpack and they have all of their life, their entire belongings in these packs, just trying to make a living and find a way to survive and find something to eat. It is a really good film. It definitely, as you can tell by the beginning of the movie, it's not going to end well for this character. But we also, instead of just seeing this person as another homeless bum who froze to death, we see her as a person. This wasn't just someone whose, life could be thrown away. This was a person who was trying to survive best as the rest of us are. And it was a very well received film, but it was actually not a movie that France was planning on really putting on the international market or the international festival circuit. So Varda, she finds out that Uta France isn't considering this to go to the Venice Film Festival. She just goes to Venice directly and says, "Hey, I want you to include my film in the competition." And it pays off because she wins the Golden Lion, and Sandrine Bonnaire, who plays Mona, ends up winning the Volpi Cup in Venice, which is for Best Actors, and ended up winning the Caesar as well. Again, highly recommend Vagabond. It is not the happiest film, but it is a really interesting film. And again, I would say, especially considering homelessness is on the rise and a lot more visible, to kind of take that second the next time you see someone and go like, well, who were they outside of this one fraction of a moment where I saw them? So as we enter the 1990s, Jacques Demy is sick and passes away. We, as the public, do not find out that he died of AIDS until decades later. And so at the time, Varda just says he died from a stroke. I think she might have used pneumonia one time, but she started to say stroke because at the time, for people who died of AIDS, pneumonia was often listed as the cause. So even then that became oh no, we know that's a code word for something. We can't use that anymore. And she kept it under wraps for years. She really decided to take it upon herself to be the caretaker of Jacques' legacy. Not only out of like a feeling of responsibility, but out of a feeling of love, because despite all of their troubles in the final decade of his life, she did love him and she considered him the love of her life. And he was the father of, the biological father of one of her children, but he was the father of both of her children. So she starts working with a lot of people to do preservation and restoration. In many cases, they didn't even save negatives of their own work, so they had to go find other people who might have negatives of this film or have the film strips to start work on restoring these movies. In terms of cinema, it's not exactly a great decade for Varda. Again, she's working through a lot of hurt. She does have the Jacques Nantes is about Jacques Demy. She also has The Young Girls turns 25. She has The World of Jacques Demy. Those are all well received, but she does 101 Nights, which is kind of a clip show movie, which is a tribute to cinema, but it is very poorly received, both critically and commercially. And then in 1996, she decides, I'm taking a break, and she doesn't make a film for the rest of the decade. She doesn't quite withdraw from public life, but she definitely takes some time for herself because she still needs to heal and grieve from losing Jacques, and she's also trying to make sense of the new world of filmmaking. But thankfully, her hiatus from filmmaking does not last long because in the year 2000, she really can't stay away from making films. She comes back with The Gleaners and I. So if you're wondering what a gleaner is, gleaners are people who they harvest crops, abandoned fruits, in many cases to eat, in many cases to use. But she also goes into people who kind of go through the trash, go through old art supplies. And she got the idea for this because she just saw them in her own neighborhood, and she's like, oh, I'm gonna look and see how these people live their lives. And that's one of the reasons I think Varda always continued to make movies and why she was able to sustain a career for so long because I would say kind of like Scorsese and like a lot of other great filmmakers, she is very interested in other people and in their stories. She's not interested in being the only name in the game of cinema. She's not interested in being considered one of the gods. She's not interested in being the queen of cinema, French cinema or any cinema. She just wants to make films. She just wants to make art. And Gleaners and I is a good example of that. And she had initially thought about it being a 4-part like series on television, and then it becomes a documentary feature, and she actually returns to it 2 years later to kind of see like, okay, how are they living their lives now? And this also marks a transition not only to filmmaking, but it's pretty much from here on out, she doesn't make a lot of fiction features. She kind of sticks to more documentary work now, but she also stops working on film and works with digital camera. So that's what she works with for the final 2 decades of her life and career. So in the aughts, again, we have The Gleaners and I, and then 2 years later, she starts making a lot of shorts. And she just starts making a lot of stuff for like stuff she likes. Again, she wanted to do one about her cat. That was Juju the cat. Then there's one with the Yedessa the Bears. That was about an art installation that she saw. And then she starts to move to making art installations herself and kind of not just doing films, but having her films with photography, with sculpture, like having a complete like three-dimensional art experience. She had one called Papatopia, which is Potato Utopia. Agnes loves potatoes. And that's what she really like started to do in her later years was just, I want to devote myself to making art about things that I love and that I find interesting and telling people why I love them. And in the end of the decade, she makes The Beaches of Agnes, and it turns out to be one of her first autobiographical retrospective movies, but at the time she made it, she thought it was going to be her last film. It turned out to not be the case, thankfully, because in the 2010s, she still had more art to give us. So she had a TV series, which is kind of about her artwork and her passions. She has Faces Places, which I also showed Todd last night, which is an absolutely delightful little film about her and a visual artist who's 50 years her junior going on a little road trip to make art. And then she has a final film in 2019. But the bigger thing that happens for her in the 2010s isn't the the movies that she releases, it's the international recognition she's had for her career. So she gets an honorary Palme d'Or in 2015, and she's the first woman to receive that. And in 2017, she gets an honorary Academy Award. Of course, Martin Scorsese is there to cheer her on, but there's also a lot of women there as well to honor her. And in 2017, this is kind of on the heels where Me Too is starting to be a thing, and there is just this there's been a longer conversation about women's place in filmmaking and boosting more women artists, and why is it so hard for a woman to get nominated for an Academy Award, or in many cases be offered the opportunity to direct an Academy Award nominated feature, let alone get nominated. So when she's at the Academy, she is presented the award by Angelina Jolie. She has a great day there, a great time there. So when this is from Ricky's book, quote, when Lamont Laurent Carpentier interviewed Varda before she left for Los Angeles, most of the questions were about close encounters of the Weinstein kind. Again, this is also kind of hanging over the Weinstein scandals hanging over everyone's head. Charpentier opened with, "Is the award a feminist act?" Varda politely answered, "No, it is a matter of cinema, but with a lot of women involved." The director explained that actress Angelina Jolie, who was also a director, would present her with the statuette. A few beats later, Charpentier asked whether Varda had ever been sexually harassed, and she answered no. Either she had forgotten about the slapping the Columbia exec who pinched her cheek, or figured that didn't rise to the level of sexual harassment. Of the many Weinstein-related questions, Varda observed that it was good that the scandal broke, quote, because it allows women to speak up and because men are being shaken up. The feminists are right to shout, she said, because, quote, as long as they're angry women, things will change. And speaking of things changing, the year later in 2018, she led a women's march at Cannes, which was a protest featuring numerous actresses and women directors to call attention to the fact that women are not as represented on both the national and international stage, and it's just harder to break into. Again, filmmaking, despite being around for over a century, can still be a bit of a boys' club. And I do have this image right there. That's Varda with her two-colored hair, all of her polka dots, with Celine, some of the people with her, Kristen Stewart, Léa Seydoux, Ava DuVernay, Cate Blanchett, and she's also with Celine Sciamma, who I'm also going to be covering for a program down the line. I do love the fact that despite her being the shortest one there, she is certainly not short in stature. And if there's one movie I would say to seek out from our 2017, it would absolutely be Faces Places. That is a delightful little movie. So she meets up with JR. He's a French visual artist. He takes photos of people, prints them out to be sometimes life-size or in some cases bigger than life-size, and pastes them on the side of structures, usually buildings. In actually one moment in this film, they take the portraits of three different women who are the wives of dock workers, including one of whom who is a trucker, the only trucker in her company, and they paste them on the side of shipping containers. So she and JR, they go across rural France. They have a camera mobile van. They take life-size portraits of the residents. They listen to their stories, and they paste them on the side of buildings and other structures. So there's the wives of the dock workers. They have one woman who there's a row of miner houses where the miners used to live that are going to be torn down. This one woman is like the final one living there. They put her portrait on there. They also get pictures of all of the old miners and put them across the row of houses. They have goats. They do one where they have just a lot of people eating one loaf of bread and kind of put them all together. It's a very fun movie. It's a tribute to art. And there's also a great camaraderie between both JR and Varda. Varda herself loves his art. She thinks he's very imaginative. He clearly respects her a lot. And it's also a good look at France. I think when a lot of people who don't live in France, when they think of we pretty much only see Paris, or we only think of Paris. This is giving us a look at a lot of the regular everyday people who do not live in a big city. But there's also a bittersweet part of this. So at the end of the film, and throughout the movie, Varda keeps talking about a short film she made with Godard and how JR wearing his sunglasses kind of reminds her of Godard. And she goes to his new home. Apparently, they had talked and they want to meet up. And he doesn't come to the door, and he had written a message to her, which she kind of takes it as like he's not coming out. And the message he writes to her is something where it's a place where she, Godard, and Jacques Demy used to go. And she kind of said, well, if he wanted to hurt me, he certainly did. And it's very sad. And the movie kind of ends with just her and JR bonding over a lake. Um, Apparently there is it was kind of as I was watching this last night, I remember like, oh yeah, everyone got mad at Jean-Luc Godard for a bit after that. And Jean-Luc Godard is not without his faults. He was a very temperamental person. He could be very volatile. He had a relationship with Anna Karina, and she had said that he was certainly not the best person to be involved with. So there might have been a lot of feelings going on, although Rosalie Varda, who helped produce the film, as Rosalie got older, she did kind of go into the business with her mother. Rosalie said, he sent me a kind of photo collage of Agnes. It was something special, and it's a secret, but he did send me something nice. I think he cared for Agnes a lot, and he saw all of her films. So maybe he didn't want to come out and see her. Maybe he didn't want to be filmed, but it, you know, doesn't change the fact that whatever his reasons were, Agnes is certainly kind of hurt by it. But still, this Faces Places is a great little movie, and there's a lot of joy in it. And again, you just look at it, it's like a tribute to the joy of art. So, sadly, Varda is no longer with us. She passed away March 29th in 2019, just a couple of months shy of her 90 of well, she was 90, a couple months shy of 91. And after a battle of breast cancer, which interesting to consider, considering the film that really broke her into the international world was Cleo from 5 to 7, and that character was also wondering if she might potentially have breast cancer. And she's buried in Montparnasse Cemetery. Jacques is also buried there. And Rosalie, when speaking of her mother's death, she said, quote, "It was difficult for us because when Agnes was dying, it was not my mother who was dying. It was a public figure. Even now, I don't think it's my mother who died. She was my mother, but since we worked on her films, every day I talk about her, I talk about her films, I renegotiate deals for them, so I feel like she is here." But the world of cinema just came out to say goodbye to this titan of cinema. Like Scorsese had previously said Agnes Varda was one of the gods, and when he had her tribute, he said, "I doubt that she ever followed in anyone else's footsteps in any corner of her life or her art, which were one and the same. She charted and walked her own path each step of the way." She and her camera. JR, who she'd worked with on Faces Places, called her a shooting star. Barry Jenkins, director of Moonlight, was a huge fan of her. I love how he just said she lived fully for every moment of those 90 damn years. Edgar Wright, director of Shaun of the Dead, uh, name checked Faces Places. Cannes put out a statement just saying like, 65 years this woman has been associated with cinema. And Madonna, which this might surprise people, Madonna was a huge fan of Agnes Varda and particularly a big fan of Cleo from 5 to 7. And there was actually talk in the 80s of remaking Cleo with Madonna, and only this time it wouldn't be breast cancer. Madonna was thinking about working the AIDS crisis into it. That project did not come to pass, but it was actually one Varda was very open to, because she was like, "Oh, this would be great. I love this idea of updating this story." But when she passed away, it certainly was, if in a way, it was kind of the last of the French New Wave was dying. I think the other person that followed her was Godard, who passed away in 2002. But it was when when he had already kind of withdrawn from life, public life in many ways. So when she died, there were a lot of people who kind of felt like that's it. The guard of French New Wave is gone. But she did leave one last film for us, which was Varda by Agnes. It's really more of a two-part TV special, but it's similar to Beaches of Agnes and kind of similar to some of the stuff she talked about in Faces Places. It's her reflecting on the things that she loved in life and just how much she loved filmmaking, how much she loved art, the people that she cared about, and just the little pleasures in life that gave her so much joy. And this was something where she was still trying to get this off the ground, and Ava DuVernay was one of the people she'd been talking with, and DuVernay helped fund it, and she actually got a lot of other people. Eva Longoria reached out to people to get people to fund this project as well. So it's I think very fitting that her final project is a labor of love that was also supported by a lot of women who were inspired by her and had the doors held open by her. And I love this quote from a review of it. Said, "At 90, she is a living artwork, her own greatest creation. We should all be so lucky to still be this curious, compassionate creative in such a ripe old age." And I think that is why Varda still endures to people, not just as a filmmaker, but as a public figure, because up until her final moments, she was someone who was just very interested. If you look at Faces Places, she wants to go and talk to other people. She wants to learn about them. And I think that's what makes a lot of true artists really tick, is they are just interested in other people's lives. I was actually talking with a couple of friends, Ellie, who's guested on this program before, about why someone like Scorsese is still going strong versus a contemporary of his time, Francis Ford Coppola, is kind of really not having the same creative output. And I said, I'm like, well, I think Scorsese and people he admires, look at who he admires. He admires people like Agnes Varda. He is interested in telling stories and he's still curious. He doesn't want to be seen as the be all end all of cinema. He sees himself as a student of cinema and someone who's still creating. And I think the same applies to Agnes. I think she always just saw herself as, I'm a person in this world and I just want to get my art out there. She never had airs about herself as a creator. And I love this picture. This was when Varda got her honorary Academy Award. That's her, Scorsese, Robert De Niro, and Guillermo del Toro, which, my goodness, what I wouldn't have paid to be at that dinner table. That sounds like a great night. And with that, if anyone has any questions or recommendations as to where to start, I will answer any of them for you. Or has anyone else seen any of Varda's work and have a favorite picture of theirs? I think someone froze. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But I can say we do have a couple of her films at the DPL. We have One Sings, the Other Doesn't. We have Faces, Places, and we have The Beaches of Agnes. So if you want to check those out, you can. I know another library has Vagabond at the very least. And again, I know if you have the Criterion Channel, Mubi might be a good place to check, and HBO Max as well if you want to check out her work. But I would absolutely recommend seeing her stuff. Her films always, even the ones that are a little sadder, definitely always bring me a joy because, again, there is just this curiosity that she has for just other people's lives that is really infectious. It makes you just want to go out and talk to a stranger. Oh, and thank you for that comment, Joanne. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. I'm going to give a quick rundown of some of our other subjects coming up next month in honor of the release of Mickey 17, which in my defense, when I initially planned this program was going to be released in April. I'm going to be talking about South Korean director Bong Joon-ho, who is one of my favorite filmmakers working today, which again, Mickey 17, great movie. In May, Todd and I are going to be taking a trip to Maine. Not literally, but we are going to be looking at the cinematic adaptations of Stephen King. We're going to be looking at the good, the bad, and the maximum overdrive of it all. And then in June, I'm going to be going back to France because I'm going to be talking about French director Céline Sciamma, who directed stuff like Petite Maman and Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Two films you should see if you haven't. So hopefully I will see you in the coming months and have a wonderful night.